Hello and welcome to Change Management Made Easy, a video series providing best practice advice for getting change management right. This is brought to you by Change Proud, a change management training and resources platform. In this episode, we're going to show you how to do stakeholder assessment. So stakeholder assessment is ultimately about identifying and managing any stakeholders that are going to be impacted by or have an influence over your change project or program. And there are ultimately 4 steps that you should go through. Identify, so identifying who those key individuals or groups are that will be considered a stakeholder in your project. Analyze, this means looking at the impact or influence they have, so the impact the change is going to have on them and the influence they will have over it. Then mapping them on your impact and influence grid, which we'll talk about, so that then you can see what response, point number 4, you need to take in order to manage and engage them. So overall, the reason you do stakeholder assessment is that with any change program, as you'll be aware, there are always many different stakeholders involved. Those who have a vested interest, those who feel like they're the ones who are going to be very impacted by it and might therefore be resisting, and then stakeholders that may even be outside of the business, such as regulatory bodies or shareholders, who also need to be involved and understand what's going on. So stakeholder assessment is a really core component part to how you manage your change project or program. And we're going to briefly talk through each of the steps one by one. Please do pause the video if you want to read more of the detail on each of these slides, because there is some more content here that you can then take yourself through to really understand what you're doing with stakeholder assessment. So step 1, identify. So we talked about this. So really this is looking at your both internal and external stakeholders. So it might be clients, regulatory bodies, internal might be leadership, management layers, all the way down to employees. You want to list out all your stakeholders by individuals plus groups. So if you're talking about a very large scale program, or you're in a business that's a very large business, you might need to do this by different functions, different operating units, even different geographies across the globe. So it really depends on what your business looks like. But ultimately that first step is identifying who they all are. Second step, analyze. So impact and influence, and you can use different terms depending on what's most relevant for your business, but usually when people talk about analyzing the stakeholders, they're usually talking about impact and influence. So impact refers to the degree of impact the change will actually have on that individual, and influence refers to the degree of influence they will have on the success of the program. So for example, a senior leader might be very influential in determining whether the program will be successful, but they might be less likely to be impacted on a day-to-day basis. Whereas a more junior employee is likely to be impacted on a bigger scale, but is likely to have a lot less influence over the key decisions or outcomes of the program. So what you really want to do in this analyze phase is list your stakeholders in terms of individuals or groups, like the table we've got at the bottom here, and then start to think about, label them in terms of what's their role, location, if that's relevant, if you're talking about different geographies, what their key priorities and issues are, so that you really understand who the stakeholder is, and then looking at their level of impact and influence from high, medium or low. And you can pause the video to look at these descriptions here in more detail. Once you've understood that, you can then start to think about, okay, so how do we now need to manage this stakeholder? Do they just need regular updates on what's going on, or do they need to have lots of communication to really engage them? So then the third step is stakeholder mapping, and this might not always be something you need to do. It depends on the scale of your program, but if you're talking about a really large scale change, it is a useful exercise to create a kind of visual map here. So you've got 4 quadrants when you're talking about a stakeholder map. So ultimately, if you look at the left-hand side of the image at the bottom here, where we've got really high levels of influence, but basically low impact, so that's more likely to be kind of really senior leaders and people, you really just want to inform and satisfy those. Whereas if you look at the very top right quadrant where we've got actively engage, that's people where they've really got high influence and high impact. So they're really important and critical to the program, and we really want to be actively engaging them a lot. So the 4 quadrants are really just a way of saying, depending on where someone is in terms of their level of impact and influence, what's the engagement approach we need to take to manage that stakeholder. And then the final step, respond. So the 4 quadrants we looked at are at the bottom of this slide here. So actively engage, inform and satisfy, stay close or keep informed. So once you know where they are in the quadrant, once you know their level of impact and influence, you can start to think about what you're going to do to manage and engage that stakeholder. So for someone who's in that really kind of actively engaged quadrant, you really want to focus a lot of your efforts there. You probably want to establish regular cadence of communication with that group or that person, really ensuring they're adequately involved in decision making. Whereas if they're in the stay close quadrant, number 3 here, it's more about just helping them to make sure they understand the value and then determining whether they can play a supporting role. They might be kind of a super user or a change champion or something along those lines, depending on your change program. And there's obviously a load of different things you can do for each of these quadrants. It's really up to you and what your business activity is usually like. But it just helps to guide the type of activity you're going to undertake with each stakeholder. If you found this video useful, for more easy to use and accessible change management training, resources and templates, visit ChangeProud. Thank you for watching.